Welcome. Good morning. Yeah! Woo! Welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas. We're in the correct track. Okay. I think we're improving, perhaps. I'd like to thank our sponsors, and especially our Inner Circle sponsors, Criddle Stack and Valley Mail. Yay! Come on. And also Amazon, BlackBerry, and the NSA. I'm supposed to say 3 of them, so I know. Okay. Anybody who supports us, we love them, no matter what. Please, cell phones, this is being streamed. Please, as a courtesy of your speaker, please check your cell phones are set to silent. I will run the microphone to everybody who wants to give a talk, and we'll speak it up, or we'll repeat the question so that we get it recorded for the streaming and recording audience. All that's said and done, let me introduce our speaker, who is Winnona DeSombre. Did I say good? Okay. She's Asian Pacific Threat Intelligence Researcher at the Recorded Future, focusing on Chinese underground hacking and communities and Eastern Asian cyber espionage campaigns. For all those who don't know, there's a wonderful book called The Tribe of Hackers, and she's in it. Buy the book, read the book. Okay? She is one of the world's best information security professionals. So, did that build it up for you? Ooh, all right. Okay. So, once again, Proving Ground, Winnona DeSombre.
Hi, everyone. I don't know if I'm one of the world's leading InfoSec people, but I'm going to give it my best shot today. How about that? So, hi, guys. Welcome to Proving Ground. My name is Winnona. Before we get started, I would like to shout out the B-Sides organizers. Thank you guys so much for allowing me to speak today, and also I'm so excited for the rest of this conference. Thank you also to my mentor, Russell. He's over there in the back. He really helped me guide this presentation through from its raw thoughts to what it needs to be. So, a little bit more about me. I'm a threat intel researcher at Recorded Future. I focus on a lot of things in the Boston area with regards to security, and if you like what you see in this talk, follow me on Twitter or don't. It's your choice. I will say that before we get started, a lot of GIFs are in here, a lot of thoughts are in here. The thoughts are mine, the GIFs are not. And if you are interested in this research in general, I actually wrote a paper on this, so you're more than welcome to check it out in more detail there. Okay, so why do we monitor criminal underground forums to begin with? There's quite a few reasons, especially if you are in threat intel like I am. For one, it's a pretty good indicator that your company has been breached if your information or your company's information ends up being sold on these marketplaces. The second is that some of these individuals will be egotistic enough to announce that they are going to target a specific company before it occurs. But my favorite reason is primarily by analyzing certain tools and the way they're talked about online, you can figure out how these shifts in targeting and tools are occurring on the criminal underground. When talking about monitoring shifting tools, of course, there are quite a few questions that aren't really answered at the moment that I wanted to tackle. For one, what is the most popular malware? Just in general, what do criminals usually talk about? The second refers more to ransomware. It's kind of in vogue lately, and how much hype should we believe in? So how much talk or how much chatter on criminal underground forums does ransomware fall into? And then one of my personal favorites is what actually causes malware to rise and fall in popularity. Like, these people on the underground forums are people like you and me, so what causes them to prefer one type of malware over the other? All of these are interesting questions, and they all fall under a single umbrella of sorts, which is how can we primarily translate something in the realm of cyber threat intelligence, like forum underground monitoring, into something that's actionable for defenders and red teamers alike? Before we get started in the research, however, there are a couple misconceptions with regards to the criminal underground. And one of them is that deep and dark web is kind of the big thing to talk about. And in reality, criminals operate pretty much anywhere on the internet where they can talk to one another. It's all the internet, it's all cat pictures, it's all places where we can coalesce and talk. Talking about these underground forums, however, they are similar in a number of ways. For one, you have vendor-to-buyer conversations and buyer-to-buyer conversations. So you have vendors putting out sales posts and people commenting on the sales post, hey, what's it like to install this? Can I get a free copy in exchange for a review? When you're talking about buyer-to-buyer, you also have, hey, I found this news article somewhere, how legit is this piece of malware? Or where can I find this particular piece of ransomware? So, I took all of these discussions and questions and correlated them together based off of what type of malware they were talking about. And between the dates of May 2018 to May 2019, that was about 4 million posts. So like I said before, because all the underground forums are composed of various sources, I did use a bunch of open web, dark web, third-party chat applications, etc., to find these posts. And when it comes to actually categorizing them based off of nicknames, various names in different languages, when you're talking about malware categories and malware families, I analyzed 61 categories and over 100,000 malware family names. These I got from my company, Recorded Future. We have a lot of this sort of data. So, when it comes to the data set and the definitions within the data set, you'll notice here that the definition of malware that I used is not really what malware is when it comes to the generic naming. So this encompasses more than just Trojans and ransomware. It also encompasses things like cryptors, which takes a piece of malware, encrypts it or packs it such that it's fully undetectable by antivirus. That's not necessarily malware, but it's talked about similarly on these forums, so I included that. Same with things like exploit kits. When it comes to the particular forum conversation, I included things like the reposts of security articles because people tend to get inspiration or discuss different types of malware in the comments. And then some spam posting because vendors like to post advertisements for their malware pretty much wherever they can. There's a couple insights that I could glean from this data. The first one is malware mentions just across the board, all forums. The second one is by language. And the third one is that initial question that I found the most interesting: what causes malware to vacillate in popularity based off of real life or forum events? So let's start with malware mentions overall. Let's start with the big stuff. When it comes to category, so one of the questions that I had was about ransomware. It does look like we should believe the hype in some regard. Ransomware was by far the most talked about malware category on underground forums. The next being cryptor, like I said, which wasn't really technically malware in its own definition, and then Trojan, web shell, etc. But the interesting thing is, when you look at family results, only one of these are ransomware. So this is the top 10 in terms of family, and a majority of them are Trojans or remote access Trojans. So what's causing this disparity? This is a really interesting way to pull apart the data. And looking even further into it, when I looked at the top 150, only 11 of them were brand name ransomware, or just names of ransomware in general. So I looked a little bit deeper into the actual contents of every post mentioning ransomware, which was a lot. And I found that about 50%, or greater than 50%, of these ransomware-related posts were general asks on both the vendor and the buyer standpoint. So what that means is, as a vendor, I maybe made something that encrypts a bunch of files, and I go, hey, I don't really know if this is ransomware, I don't really know what to call it, but I'm going to put it out there, sell it for like $2 US, let me know what you think. There's also a bunch of people that will grab a bunch of more open source ransomware or lower level ransomware and bundle it all together and sell that. And then from the buyer side, this is one of my favorites, people are looking for any ransomware at all. So they're interested in ransomware, but fundamentally don't know where to look. They don't know who the big buyers are. They don't know what is the good ransomware out there. This is one of my favorite posts kind of down here where they're saying, oh yeah, I'm like a big vendor, but I'm interested in dabbling in either GandCrab or any ransomware, and they'll trade you, I guess, MDMA or cocaine for it, so like your upper of choice. Kind of a weird barter, but I guess that's what happens down here. So now that we have the overall picture, let's dive into what happens by language. And I've had a couple people ask me throughout this research project, why separate it out by language, right? There are some underground forums where you could go in pretty much any language. Some people will interact with each other using Google Translate, for example. But I've done a couple different pieces of research where I've compared different language forums, where the majority of the posts in a forum are of one language or another, made for specifically either Russian or China or Portuguese speaking individuals. And within each of these forums, if you compare them across the board, they come from very different backgrounds. The forums are organized in completely different ways, and a lot of the individuals that frequent these forums have very different origin stories. So what I wanted to look at is if that was reflected in terms of what malware they were interested in. And when I look at the data, it does seem to be that way. So this is just a quick example that I lay out in the paper, but when you're looking at mobile malware on different language forums, it's incredibly prevalent on Chinese language forums. This is not, it's simplified, so it's not including Cantonese or Taiwanese, but when you look at English language forums, only two, which are two of the three original ones before, are in the English top 10. And then you look at Russian forums, and there's no mobile malware to be found in the top 10. So that's actually pretty interesting. I will say that there were some overarching similarities across all forums, regardless of language. For one, in every language analyzed in the top 10, there were malware families that were over 3 years old. So things like NJRAT, which has been like open source around since 2008, kind of really, really old malware. And they're still popular, which suggests that there are individuals out there that are still using these families of malware to successfully infect victim hosts, which means that there are victim hosts out there still vulnerable to really, really old malware like NJRAT. I'll say that there were also some dual-use tools in the top 10, so things like Metasploit, John the Ripper, Hashcat, things that your everyday red teamer would know about are also being traded or shared or discussed on these criminal forums. Forum-specific malware are things like forum spammers, and then GandCrab. For those of whom don't know what GandCrab is, it's an incredibly popular piece of ransomware, only found on one Russian underground forum until the namesake vendor for GandCrab ransomware, also known as GandCrab, retired in June. So from May to May, what was super interesting about GandCrab is every language forum was talking about it either in, hey, look at this news article about GandCrab, or, hey, I've heard about GandCrab, where can I find it? So that kind of leads pretty interestingly into the correlations between malware and real life, right? So going back to the original bar graph, kind of with the families, you have by type, a majority of them are remote access Trojan. You have SpyNote again, which is that Android malware, GandCrab, the ransomware, NLBrute, which is a brute forcing tool, and then XRumor, which is a forum spamming tool. When you separate all of these out by growth, this super messy graph, but bear with me, you see some really interesting spikes and valleys in terms of what is being talked about by month. And so what I was able to do is every time there was a spike in a particular piece of malware, I went into the forums in which that spike occurred and analyzed what exactly they were reacting to on those forum comments or message boards. And what I found were three primary correlated events for this year at least. So one is just being a good malware vendor, so just providing the basic feedback, the community engagement, and I'll talk a little about that later. The sale of malware in sets, so like bundling things up, like I said before, kind of a buy one, get one free situation. And then the distribution of cracked malware, or what I affectionately like to call malware piracy. So Moving on to being a good malware vendor. There were 3 big events that were associated with this kind of grouping. This is something that GandCrab, as I show here, was really, really good at. So they would advertise regular updates to their software because you want people to continue using it. You want people to make sure that they're still interested in the malware. You want to do some bug fixes. You want to develop this as a professional business person. The next was real-world news articles, usually in the form of advertisements. Like this image shows here, this is a really good review by Security Weekly, saying that GandCrab is now the most powerful threat of its kind, whether directed at a single person or an organization. Like, what kind of software gets a review like that, right? And then finally, you have things like community engagement and customer service. So interacting with your buyers, saying thank you when someone posts a positive review, answering some frequently asked questions, so on and so forth. All of these, when done correctly, usually resulted in a rise of chatter around that malware in general. The next thing was malware sold in sets. So what I mean by this is somebody will take a bunch of malware across various forums, maybe some open source ones, bundle them all up and sell them. There's a couple reasons that references would spike here. For one, it's search engine optimization in its most basic form. If you search for any of these 4 pieces of ransomware, this sales post will come up. But the other thing is that sometimes these bundles would include complementary tools. So what I mean by this is Warzone Rat, which is a proprietary piece of malware, would usually come with a cryptor that was built specifically for that rat. So if you wanted to use a cryptor and a malware combo, you know that these 2 would work the best together. And then things like XRumor, which like I said was a forum spammer, when paired with a CAPTCHA breaker like XEvil, you could spam forums pretty efficiently because you knew that even if there was a CAPTCHA involved, you can just use that tool in conjunction with the forum spamming tool. And then finally, you have things like cracked malware. And so just delving into a little bit more what I mean by malware piracy, when you have a piece of software, say like Office 365, usually when you open it, you have a little window that pops up that says, hey, just to make sure you're a verified buyer, put in your license key, please. That thing happens all the time in proprietary malware as well. So when you buy something from a vendor, they'll usually give you a key, you can put that in, it'll ping something back to the vendor saying, hey, this person has activated their malware. So when I say cracked versions of malware, somebody has gone in and similarly to when you try and buy a pirated version of Office 365, which I would never, ever recommend to anyone. Piracy is no joke, kids. The person who has cracked that version of Office 365 has found a way to either replicate the software in an almost indistinguishable way or find a way to circumvent that license key check. So it's precisely the same thing with proprietary malware. The interesting thing about malware piracy is how it interacts or how it affects the vendor. So this timeline here is kind of cool. It's about Azorult, which is one of the top 10 malware families. It's a proprietary stealer, or it was, until Gazorp was released. So Gazorp was a cracked version of Azorult, and you see that there's a little spike here when Gazorp is released. Later on, the original vendor of Azorult released updates to their stealer to differentiate themselves from the pirated version. So why would you want to buy this pirated version, which may be cheaper, but doesn't have these new updates? So you have a bump in supply, and then a bump in the updated version. Then, after some dispute, which you see in like the tiny little boxes over there, the original author actually shut down their service. So they decided that they would shut down their proprietary version of malware, and then the cracked version of the updated version of malware gets released online, and then you see a massive spike again. So it's an interesting vendor-to-vendor battling it out situation when it comes to malware piracy. So, we've learned a lot about malware today. Is this actually a risk to my environment? So why or how much should I care about this? And so based off of how old a lot of the malware is, how a lot of them aren't really effective without a delivery vehicle because these are all commodity pieces of malware, it's usually going to be of a lower threat to a company environment. But because it is commonly used, it's commonly discussed, commonly bought and sold, it is going to be hitting a company environment with higher frequency, or at least I can assess that with a moderate degree of confidence. I will also say that in some cases, these, at least the 8 out of the top 10, have been reported on in the wild, and some of them are a jumping off point for higher impact campaigns. In conclusion, I want to say a couple things. The first one is just individuals who buy and trade malware and who deploy malware are individuals, and they lose interest in malware, they gain interest in other malware, and so the landscape is going to change. It's definitely not something that's static. If you look at this graph over here, which is January to July, I did a little bit of a data update. The top 10 is very different here. There's 6 of the original top 10, and then they're also in completely different orders now, except for NJRAT, which for some reason is going to be popular until the end of time. There's also, because there's dual-use tools commonly discussed on the underground forums, it's really essential for people who are defending an enterprise to understand the red team that they either interact with or to understand red teaming tools in general. If you don't know what your red team might be using, a cyber criminal could be using that exact same tool. And also, finding baselines against different actors are important because they focus on different malware, especially if you understand where your threat landscape lies in terms of the attackers. So for example, a company in Japan might be more worried about Chinese cyber criminals, whereas a company in Ukraine might be worried about Russian cyber criminals, et cetera. But overall, I really hope that people could use this report as a baseline for patching. And what I mean by that is, in the paper at least, I try to answer this overall question by doing a couple specific things. After finding the most commonly discussed malware, you're able to actually figure out, even just based off of news reporting, what delivery vehicles are associated with these pieces of malware. So what exploit kits are being used, what kind of phishing tools are being used, and then prioritizing patching against the vulnerabilities that are utilized by these delivery vehicles. And with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I'd be happy to take questions. So thank you guys so much for being out here. Yeah, should I? Yeah.
So if we look at the cost that people are willing to pay for this malware,
No worries. So as for cost, I didn't factor in cost, mainly because I'm not an economist, but it's also more difficult to factor in who's actually buying because there's that discrepancy really between the people who are willing to discuss whether they've bought it or what they're interested in. So really, this is the closest methodology that I've been able to find when it comes to people interested in malware is the discussion. But to be clear, you're right, I didn't factor in cost because I have no idea if people are actually buying the malware. So usually when it comes to persistent sellers, I will say that that's usually someone advertising one form of malware and providing regular updates. So one of the reasons why GangCrab was so consistent was because they provided updates up to like, what, 5 point something? So just providing that regular sense of, hey, this is new, this is still something that you should be interested in. But you are absolutely right. Usually if somebody doesn't provide those regular updates, they usually fall out of common references. With regards to Cobalt Strike, huh? Oh, could you repeat the question? Oh, me? Oh. His question was, have I come across many cracked versions of Cobalt Strike? And if so, do I think it's malware or do you use? That Cobalt Strike is actually not something that I've found very often in terms of sales posts. But I will say that it's also not my area of expertise in terms of Cobalt Strike in general, unfortunately. But I do know that there are quite a few reports on those types of altered software of Cobalt Strike being found in the wild. And if you want to talk after, I could definitely send you towards that report. What's up?
Did you compare your results with what the major antivirus vendors are reporting as having seen?
No, I have not. But that would be a really interesting take on that, the kind of continuation of this report. That's a really good idea. Thank you. Oh, we're done. I'm available like outside if you want to keep asking questions, but thank you.